Hey everybody, welcome to the show. We have a guest on this week. Everybody help me welcome Chase.
Hey guys.
So last week I did a podcast on the MBTI, Myers-Briggs, and I have a lot of disagreements with it, even though I would consider myself a Jungian. I was just telling you about, not officially a Jungian. I don't know, what's your stance on that? I'm not officially a Jungian, but I would consider myself a student of Jung. It's difficult to call yourself a Jungian when you haven't read everything that he said, and a lot of what he says is a little bit obscure and esoteric. So I don't know, but man, of all the psychologists out there, I would say Jung is definitely the biggest influence on my life.
I completely agree with that. I'd probably say the same thing. Would I classify myself as a Jungian? I would say yes, but only because I'm not a Freudian, right? Because everyone usually has this whole point of view where it's like, okay, hey, you're either a Jungian or you're a Freudian. Which one are you? And I can't stand Freud whatsoever. There's only a few things that I utilize Freud for. Otherwise, I'm just like, get away from me, please.
You know what was really good about Freud, though, is he helped Jung. I think he
That's
needed to
true.
be there for Jung to develop. I
I
agree. I
completely
mean,
agree.
Jung's way better. I think he has a way better view of, well, maybe we can get into it, but he really needed to be there for Jung to take off. So yeah, I guess I
Oh, for
wouldn't
sure.
consider myself a Jungian. Well, this is interesting. So, how did you get into Jung?
Well, uh, it really is me back at age 21. I was in a horrible marriage at the time, and I needed to come up with some answers. So I basically just started doing research, and I've been researching this topic for probably about 11 years at this point. And I didn't actually come to an understanding of it until I was about 26, 27. So from 20, so about 5 years after I first started studying the topic, basically. And
Not that long for Jung
yeah,
to
it
start to
just,
understand it.
yeah, it's yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. But it was mostly out of necessity or out of survival is why I did it. And you know, I am an autodidact. I've never actually had any formal psychology education or training whatsoever. Quite frankly, I met my mentors while I was homeless and basically couch surfing to a point. And one of my mentors, I actually started talking about MBTI related concepts and psychology to people in front of a customer one day, and he got really mad at me, and then he humiliated me in front of them, and basically read my mail to me in the process, basically showing and proving how wrong I was. And I've never been so humiliated in my life at that point in time because it was in front of a customer in a high-rise building in downtown Bellevue, Washington, the Copper Building specifically, and it was horrible. So I felt really bad about that. I left. But the following day, my mentor comes up to me and he's like, "Hey, you know, I'm going to teach you how to do this right." And so I just threw up my hands. Was like, "All right, I know nothing. You know everything. Tell me what I need to know." And he taught me a lot of concepts, including the type grid, and that's where I really got started. Even though I already had a bunch of MBTI Myers-Briggs related knowledge for half a decade already built up at that standpoint, and then I was taught a more accurate way after that, basically.
So desperation.
Desperation
That's
was
always really
completely
helpful
motivation.
discovering these things. I think yeah, when I first got into Jung, was it a desperation? I don't know. There was just some sense when I started to read Jung that there was just a sense that there was not answers, but a better understanding of what was going on in these ideas. And that I think just led me down this rabbit hole. And I hear I found myself, God, it's probably been 20 years since I first picked up any sort of Jungian book, and this is my life. This is what it's become: is talking about these issues and debating the Myers-Briggs type inventory on YouTube. And honestly, I couldn't be any happier with it. I absolutely love it. But yeah,
I,
I've had a few just real intense moments like that where it really kind of changed me around, and I saw Jung for what it really was. Well, anyways, so yeah, so you started doing the type indicator in an incorrect way, or you started reading Jung in an incorrect way. You implied, but then you started to look at it in a more correct way.
well, to be more direct about it, The standard Myers-Briggs type indicator approach, because let's be honest, the MBTI is nothing more than just a test, and that's all it is. It's just a test, but there's a whole culture built around the MBTI in its format as a test. And like taking from my own statistics of the people that we've coached, that we've verified, as well as with some of our business to business practices with the firm, we realized that statistically speaking, when applying the MBTI and having to go in and like unscrew it up basically and untangle everything for each people who take the MBTI test specifically, we've seen that it's about 28 to 31% accurate actually total overall, and this is over probably almost 1,000 people being verified that we've done since we started. And that's a pretty staggering statistic if you think about it in terms of accuracy. And it really just stems from the fact that people just can't be honest with themselves because there's an external perception of oneself and an internal perception
Oh,
of
good.
oneself.
I had that objection here, so it's good I don't
Awesome.
have to bring it up. I'll cross that off the list. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
people don't have any idea who they are.
Yeah,
I
no
mean, you'll
problem.
find people who have not had a conversation, like a real honest sit down conversation with somebody in 5, 10 years. And they're going to take some tests and then decipher who they are. You have no idea who you are.
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
it's
continue.
no, I completely agree with you, and that's one of the challenges that I've had with the MBTI specifically. But quite frankly, that's where I was. That's where I was when I first started teaching or learning about it, is because I was learning the typical what's available to everybody else, the wrong way when it comes to the letter dichotomies. And it wasn't until I started branching out, because my mentor. He taught me what the way he was taught, but then he brought me to his mentor, and then I learned from his mentor, who was the master, and is still arguably the master this day. I mean, he's still. I like to think that I'm better than that my second mentor in some ways, but he's better than me in others. So now it's kind of like, okay, now I have the same skills as the master, but there's still give and take. But the point is though, it's it's really bad when you realize that the world is not flat, because that's kind of the beliefs that people, the type of beliefs that people have when they're utilizing the Myers-Briggs type indicator letter dichotomies. Those letter dichotomies are so ingrained in people, and the definitions of the cognitive functions, as they're coined by Jung, cognitive senses, it's completely different. And then to even make it
Right.
more abstract, socionics, and then using socionics and comparing socionics directly to MBTI while studying under my second mentor, it opened a whole new world. And I realized, yeah, the world is actually not flat. But the problem is, if I speak about it, then everyone tells me I'm out of my mind, you know? So,
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Let's go back about 30 seconds. You were talking about a dichotomy. Were you
yeah,
referring to a false dichotomy in the types, like between thinking and feeling, between introverted, extroverted? How just
absolutely.
because you're one doesn't mean you're not another? Because that was going to be another objection that I bring up. People think that, oh, being more thinking takes away from any sort of feeling function that you can have. And that's absolutely not true. Jung, at least as far as I can tell, he never meant it that way. People think they're only one or the other.
Yeah, I agree with you. It really comes down to I call it what I compare this to is at least with my content is yin and yang equilibrium, primary and secondary roles. Everyone has primary and secondary roles, and then because of that, just because it's like handedness, right? It's all about preference. I'm left-handed, right? And then some people are right-handed, and of course it's probably different illusion because I'm in front of a camera right now. But with my left hand, I prefer to use my left hand for some things. With my right hand, I prefer to use my right hand for some things. It all comes down to mental preference, and someone's persona is that way. The letter dichotomies, I think, are just absolutely limited because, like, oh, that guy's
Yeah.
obviously a thinker, and I'm like, no, actually, he's not. Yeah, just because he's an INTJ doesn't mean he has feelings.
Yeah, for whatever reason, he's developed as a thinker. He's had to use that function, and maybe he's put himself in situations where he has had to use that function more from his family upbringing, and there's probably some genetic component to it also. But that's just one function that he's working on. I mean, I liken it to like a body fat test. The MBTI is like a MBTI is like a body fat test, but the only difference is we don't take the body fat test and go, oh well, I'm at 20% body fat. There's nothing that's just who I
It's
am.
ballparking.
It's like, well, it's about where you are now based on how you've been. You can change it if you want. You're not in this, but and I know that's how Jung never meant it that way, but that's how people interpreted it. And probably one of the most startling things to me, or the most damaging things to me, I mean, most of my listeners are young men. It's probably about 85-15 men. And people will say something like, well, I can't, whatever it is, I can't ask out that girl because I'm introverted. That'll be their reason in their head. Oh, I'm introverted, so I can't do it. And I think they take this test, or the way that a lot of maybe proctors administer this test, they don't offer any context. And I'm guessing you would agree here on that.
I would. The reason why is because I don't know. Like it's funny when someone hires me to like verify what type they are and actually explain what their type really means outside of letter dichotomies. A lot of them experience identity crisis. We have seen this happen so many times where people are pegging their entire identities based on the MBTI letter dichotomies, and I'm like, no, stop, don't. That's not actually how it works. No,
Yeah.
and I break it down for them, and then it starts going like, "Oh wow!" And then all of a sudden I get comments like, "Okay, do you have like a camera in my bedroom? Are you stalking me or something?" I'm like, no, I'm not. I just actually know this stuff. It's not about that, please.
So you think it's helpful to show people where they are and probably what they need to work on, what their inferior function is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, their inferior function, also the villain function or nemesis function, according to Dr. John Beebe, their critic function. I maintain that it's actually a little bit deeper than that because you get people like Dave Powers out there talking about cognitive loops. He's not wrong that cognitive loops exist, but his issue is just that why do they exist? That's where I disagree with Dave Powers because why they exist is because people have underdeveloped parent functions or auxiliary functions, as other people call them. And in my opinion, each side of a person's psyche, of the four that there are, they have to develop the parent function or the auxiliary function per each and every one of them. Because they gain, like, for example, in your ego, which would be like what your main type would be according to MBTI. So if someone says, "Oh, I'm an INTJ," like for some reason everyone thinks they're an INTJ on the MBTI test, but that's another story. Uh, when they take that test, they like
Yeah, probably because somebody who would be more likely to be an INTJ would find themselves online taking that test, I would imagine.
yeah, exactly.
Self-selecting in that respect. I'm sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
no, it's fine. You can interrupt me anytime. If you're living in the moment, sometimes you just got to get a word in edgewise before you lose your thought. It's all good. Uh,
Yeah.
with that being said, oh, I'm an INTJ and I've pegged my entire identity on this. Well, INTJs need to learn their extroverted thinking parent or auxiliary function, which gives them personal responsibility, where they're being responsible with their beliefs and actually spending time to verify and research out their beliefs before they make decisions based on their beliefs. Whereas if someone is not doing that, they're just going to do whatever they feel like and do whatever they want instead of developing a set of principles to live by, which makes them immature. You see what I'm saying? And that's the difference. People don't understand these concepts and they hold so tightly to these MBTI letter dichotomies that it's actually inhibiting their own personal growth. Well, I'm an introvert, so I shouldn't be the one to initiate with this woman. No, like take an INFJ, right? Or if you have introvert intuition as an introvert, you need to be the one initiating because you're supposed to be giving an experience and making that introverted sensor woman feel comfortable. That's actually what it means, and that means there's responsibilities on introverts to actually initiate, just like there's responsibilities for some extroverts to actually be responding. And I'm one of those people. I may be an extrovert, but when it comes to like relationships with people, is it my responsibility to initiate with a woman? People like me have more success with women coming to us instead of us going to women. If we go to women, we look creepy AF. But then it's like, okay, I don't want to be a creeper, so I'm just gonna let them come to me and demonstrate their desire for me instead.
Yeah. Huh. Well, I found in my single life that I had to be the one going and talking to women, no matter how creepy I looked. It's like either that or nothing at all. So that's how I figured out how to survive. Um, where do you think we get our types from, though? I found this quotation. Maybe I'll just really quick from paragraph 33 in Psychological Types. And this is pretty much, it's not the only time that Jung talks about it in this book, but whenever else he talks about it from my reading, it's just a reiteration of this. And he says, the natural course of instinct, like everything in nature, follows the line of least resistance. One man is rather more gifted here, another there. Or again, adaptation to early environment of childhood may demand relatively more reserve and reflection or relatively more empathy and participation according to the nature of the parents and the circumstances. So all Jung's saying there is, I don't know where these types come from. I don't know why people are more introverted versus extroverted thinking that's how they perceive the world. It has something to do perhaps with who they are biologically. Like you said, their parents. You seem to imply that our types are a response to our parents.
Kind of. I actually think, again, think of a Venn diagram. Human being. A human being is a Venn diagram. On the left side, you have nature. On the right side, you have nurture. And then you're putting them together, and then you have a human being, and that's human being. And this Venn diagram is also a yin and yang equilibrium at the same time, right? One circle is the black part, one circle is the white part, right?
And by yin and yang, you mean one's more dominant, one's the shadow.
Exactly. One's more dominant, one's more shadow. So you have nature versus nurture, and a person's nature, it is what it is. But the thing is that the way that our minds work, cognitively speaking, is that they're extremely adaptable and extremely fluid, especially as children. And this is why child soldiers exist. I mean, I could go all Hideo Kojima Metal Gear on you right now and talk about his interpretation of child soldiers and the like. But
I'm not sure
yeah,
what that is,
not a
but
bad thing. It's a video game. Yep.
okay.
Yeah. But but the point is children's minds are extremely malleable and adaptable. So for example, in my own experience, like I was a certain personality type as a small child, but then it changed as my sister was born, as abuse started happening in my life, based on family abuse that I had to deal with, and then I had to basically become somebody that I wasn't. And it wasn't until after I was away from my family that I finally was able to actually become who I really was and go back into my ego, because I wasn't in my ego so long because of all the damage. And that was based on nurtural environmental things. So Jung is absolutely correct. It is following the line of least resistance and providing adaptation. However, what Jung does not talk about per se in that particular quotation is that there is a foundation of a psyche, a foundation of a persona that pre-exists the nurtural impacts. And I didn't believe that. I didn't think that that was true. But after having my own children, being involved with youth ministry, and knowing a lot of small children in my life, I come to realize that psychologically speaking, there is actually something there that pre-exists the nurtural impacts, and that's
Yeah.
what I call nature. The nature pre-exists. The problem is, though, is that our nature can change based on the external factors, but only in a limited manner. It's not necessarily unlimited. There's still a system it follows.
Murky waters of nature versus nurture. I
Yes.
don't know if we're ever going to resolve this, but I agree. And definitely, are some things are more nature, some things are more nurture. I think with personality, let's just say 50-50. That's what I always say. But yeah, there is definitely a nurture. Yeah, you see some kids and you just go, oh, they're going to be that way the rest of their lives. That's just who they are. And it's neither bad nor good, but it's just who they are. Okay. Yeah, I just, yeah, I see a lot of problems with the people thinking that this is just the way they are. And really what it is, it's a philosophical orientation in the world. And that's how Jung talks about it in psychological types. He talks about the, difference between nominalism and realism. I mean, this is just a different way of viewing reality. It's a philosophical way of viewing reality that I think a lot of people take now and they generalize it out to mean, oh, this is my psychological approach, or this is my personality. I mean, what I found, I mean, tell me if I found that kids who grow up in more religious households tend to be more intuitive as opposed to sensing. And then if you grow up in the more like the NPR, you go into National Wildlife Camp, you're just more sensing. And I think these are just two dominant epistemologies in our culture now, which we call the left and the right. I don't think that's really exact. I think it's two dominant epistemologies, and that's kind of how you're trained.
Well, at last, something we disagree on. Okay,
Okay,
so
good.
no, I actually disagree with the intuitive versus sensing in religious backgrounds. So for example, my sister and I, we were raised in religious backgrounds, but she's sensing and I'm intuitive, basically. Completely different approach. Or someone that I coached this morning, actually, who was thinking he was intuitive when he's not. He's actually very sensing, and he's been in church his entire life. I think that's more of a stereotypical approach. However,
Yeah, I'm
uh,
just saying generally, these are patterns that I see.
right, right. Well, you're not wrong because there's actually a little deeper component there. So let's say you're a sensor, right? But if you're more depending on your cognitive focus, and cognitive focus is like the slants that people are not really aware of when it comes to like, so ooh, I'm XYZ type according to the MBTI. Great. Well, that's nice. That's your ego. But what about your subconscious? Your subconscious is your ego. According to inverse theory, I recommend that. The inverse theory is when you have your ego's four functions, you flip them upside down, and then it becomes your subconscious, basically. And that's that side of the mind is your subconscious. But your subconscious, because their functions are flipped upside down, you become an intuitive. And your mind is more slanted towards your subconscious side. So when you're in a religious setting, for example, there's a chance that you would be, if you're as a sensor, you'd be more subconscious focused, which means you would have more intuitive tendencies compared to other sensors. Whereas there's a same sensor of your own type, they could be shadow focused or unconscious focused, right? Which is basically the opposite functions as your other four and the other stack below that. And then you become more shadow focused as a result, but it's still a sensor. It's still the same. Like, so an ISFJ ego has an ESFP unconscious or shadow, they're still sensors. But if they're more slanted towards their subconscious, they're actually more ENTP focused because that's the opposite of the ISFJ. When they flipping the functions up around, they have the same cognitive functions, they're just flipped upside down, and then they are actually ENTP slanted. They're still an ego ISFJ, but which side of their mind are they more accustomed to entering into over the course of their life? How does nurture impact this? Because nurture comes into the ego, and the ego either can deal with it or it can't. And if it can't, it's got to outsource to the subconscious or as to outsource to the unconscious, basically. And people have to make decisions based on those locations. And then over time, someone gets used to using that side of their psyche, basically, in order to answer those problems, right? And that's why we have sensors with a larger intuitive slant. And when you're observing things in general, I would say I would posit that it's very possible that what you're observing is that sensors who are in church all their life may be more subconscious focused because they're more getting in tune to that intuitive metaphysical properties of, religion, etc.
And but just to be clear, by subconscious focus, you mean what's less dominant or more dominant?
It's now the subconscious is less dominant, but it can become more dominant. That's the issue because you
When
go
it's
into
repressed, like being in
correct.
church, your intuitive function is more likely to be triggered or, I guess, used. It's a
And
better
your
word.
sensing is not correct. And you're right. It's repression, and it's making your subconscious conscious in that process, just like you can make your unconscious conscious. When unlocking the consciousness of the subconscious itself and bringing it into the conscious, that's when it actually can become dominant. Because instead of being afraid, because fear is the key to the it's known as the fourth gateway function or the inferior function. When the inferior is an inferior function, well, you can go into that inferior function as the gateway into your subconscious. What this means is that you can enter it in an orderly manner or a chaotic manner. If you're doing it chaotically, you're doing it as a result of fear, because a person's fear exists in their fourth function, right? And then they're being afraid and they're acting in their subconscious fearfully, it's not dominant. However, if they're doing it in an orderly manner, it is dominant because then that fear becomes aspirational and they are aspiring with their inferior function. So my inferior function is introverted sensing. So I'm very uncomfortable or afraid of doing things I've never done before. So I have to force myself to do things I've never done before and gain new skills and new pieces of information that I've never done before because I have this insane fear of the unknown. It's horrible. But as a result of this fear of the unknown, I can have faith and faith in myself and then aspire to do those new experiences,
Yeah.
right?
So what you're saying is you're introverted is more unconscious, so you're more afraid of it.
It's well, my introversion could be it could be as a result of fear or worry. They're two separate things. Fear, fear is false evidence appearing real, according to Les Brown. But once I aspire, I can be like I could become an ISFJ while I'm in ENTP basically, and become a better ISFJ than an actual typical ISFJ. But when I'm dealing with worry, and my worry is my introvert intuition, I worry about my own future all the time. And if I just get over my worry and have faith instead, then I could bring my unconscious to conscious, which is an INTJ, and I could become this INTJ. So this is why a lot of my critics tell me that, oh, you're actually an ENTJ when they're trying to tie me by the worthless letter dichotomies, because they just don't understand the fact that my INTJ is a TE user. It is rational, which means I'm more organized than typical ENTPs, because guess what? I'm unconscious focused. That's my cognitive focus. I'm actually, my mind adapted to using my unconscious, not my subconscious, and I'm more organized and more responsible and more extroverted thinking than a typical ENTP would be. And people are not aware of this phenomenon.
It seems to me that focusing on the types just makes it more complicated because you just I
It
understand this
can.
stuff pretty well, but you kind of lost me there.
Oh, okay.
Like as opposed to just focusing on, and I'm glad you brought up the fear because I think that's more fundamental, our emotions and how we relate with our emotions. Because I think
Right.
that is more fundamental. And then whatever type that ends up being, however we manage our emotions, that's the type that we can, I would just say, not that we are, but that's the type that we can use in that situation.
Correct. Absolutely.
So I
It's
mean,
all about
I
it's all
see
about the
these types
tools.
as just like a grab bag of things. I think the way that Jung talks about them, it's okay. I'm going to manage my emotions in the best way possible, and then here are functions that I can incorporate in my life, like the archetypes. Here are archetypal functions that humans have evolved to use, and you can use whatever one you want in whatever situation you want. But that doesn't preclude the proper management of your emotions.
I completely agree. This is why I'm against labels like BPD, NPD, and all those psychological disorders, because I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm just saying that all too often people are misdiagnosed as a result of a lack of understanding of oneself. When you look at it specifically, it is a grab bag. It's like a toolbox, right? But here's the thing: some people are just better at a hammer or a screw gun. You see what I'm saying? And it's just which of those tools are you better or more capable of using and utilizing, right? And that's really what it comes down to. It's what's what are people more familiar with, and it's using the unfamiliar tools, the unfamiliar features or components or sides of your mind. That's what makes you become more balanced as a human being, and that's what gets you more closer to cognitive integration, or as the Buddhists would say, enlightenment, basically, because you're becoming more of a balanced individual. Because instead of just being in your comfort zone all day long and using the tools that you're used to using to solve issues, that you come up, or obstacles in your life, you want to be able to use all of the unfamiliar ones too, and then gain mastery of those as well. So
Yeah,
you become
and
a
it's
more rounded
helpful to
individual.
know that those ways of being are there. Like it's
Exactly.
helpful to know, like, oh, I could be sensing here, or I could be, more feeling. It's helpful to know that, oh, I could be more of a king. I didn't even know that was possible. Or more of a warrior. But that
Exactly.
doesn't mean that's who
Yeah.
you are.
Yeah, for example, I mean, if we're going to compare an ISFJ to like an INFJ, how do they both, become the warrior, right? Like the ISFJ does it from the point of view of trying to strengthen other people and create loyalty in others and have their own wolf pack, basically. Just the will hunting approach from Goodwill Hunting, or you have the ISFJ approach, which is more related to Bruce Lee, where it's mastering self-discipline such that you can actually engineer a better way of doing things, the best way of doing things for the sake of others. And then he developed the art of Jeet Kune Do. But that's his definition or his approach to the warrior archetype. Both types are capable of maintaining the warrior archetype as a result. And this is the warrior archetype as told by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. But but they have different ways of getting there. Everyone can achieve the same thing, but they have different approaches. Although not every approach is ideal per, result or per outcome, but it doesn't mean that someone can't get there. It's like the tortoise versus the hare, right? Hard work always beats talent.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then that's how I describe it too. I describe well, what I think is more fundamental is managing emotions. You got to manage your emotions. You got to know where your anxiety is coming from, where your anger is coming from. And then, but how you manage the emotion could be more a personality thing. And people with different personalities, I agree, would do it a little bit differently in different situations. And I would say the same thing for neuroticism, which isn't really covered by the MBTI. But that's like an extra thing to throw in there. Just people who are more neurotic will just manage emotions in a little bit different way. Doesn't make it any better or worse. But I really think
Exactly.
the it comes down to the emotions first and foremost, and how are we managing our emotions? I don't know. I just see, and it's like a bigger cultural problem we could say of when people want to find out more about their psychology. It's alluring in a way to just take a test and say, okay, this is who I am, and then you don't have to challenge yourself. You can say, oh, I'm not going to go ask out that girl because I'm introverted, when really you're just afraid of girls. But that's a great excuse in your mind to say, well, this is just the way I am and there's nothing I can do about it. And so while I agree with pretty much everything that Jung says in psychological types, I was going back through my highlighted parts last night to get ready for this. I think I pretty much agree with everything that he says. I just think the way that we interpret it now in our culture is really damaging.
Oh, absolutely. It's like it's that people are using their MBTI type as a crutch or as an excuse to get through everything. And to be fair, I've been accused of that even as a result of the system or my way of doing Jungian analytical psychology. I've also been accused of that. The
Well,
thing,
to be fair, I only watched a few of your videos again in preparation for this. So again, I'm not like a scholar of you or anything, but it seems
sure.
like that's what you were doing too. You were saying, well, this is who you are, and this is how you're just going to respond in certain situations. Now, maybe in other videos you go into, just because you are a certain type doesn't mean you're in that box. It just describes like the body fat test, describes what's going on now.
Yeah, I'm getting away. It's not. I've always been getting away from the boxes and realizing here's the top of the box, and that would be like the who are the INFJs video, who are the ESTPs, like the first approach, right, to it. And then people are like, well, that's what I am, or I don't agree with because, but I'm like, that's just the top of the box, guys. There's so many other levels. And the thing is that who's going to be able to read or watch all 300 of my lectures that I have out there right now? They're
You
probably
have a
not
lot
going
of
to be able
content.
to do. Yeah,
There's a
it's
lot there.
yeah.
Yeah,
I've
okay, good.
only and I haven't even gotten through 10% of it yet. There's so much more, and it's really frustrating because to be able to get those out there, cognitive mechanics is season 18. It hasn't come out yet, and it's going to really show people like literally how the energy moves inside of your brain to be able to get to your familiar tools, your unfamiliar tools. Where are you in the grab bag? What are you using in the grab bag, right? And that's what I'm trying to get people to realize. It's actually a complex grab bag. That's why I talk about the four sides of the mind, and each of those cognitive functions within each of the four sides goes way beyond what they're actually like the typical letter dichotomies. Because you're right. People, they think it's their identity and then they use it as an excuse or a crutch, and they shouldn't. But then they assume that that's what I'm saying because they're like, oh, it's just a more abstract box. And I'm like, it seems like that, but reality, there's probably 1,040 different combinations of cognition per person out there anyway. So, and I can only cover so much. I'm getting there, but just one thing at a time, guys. You know what I'm saying? There's just so much.
Okay. Yeah, so how do you do your type? So you test people, you have your own test, and you type them?
So I do it. I do it. There's different methods. The main method that I utilize is known as the type grid, and this was taught to me by my mentors. And then in using the type grid as the foundation, I've developed other methods on top of the type grid, like the rapport method. That's what I use in my coaching sessions. But what that does is you have the type grid, which is basically it's just like times tables, like multiplication tables, right? And then I take Stephen Montgomery, PhD. He wrote People Patterns. A little bit of Mark Hunziker's work. Dr. John Beebe, who did Energies and Patterns of Psychological Type. Dr. Linda Barron's approach, talking about interaction styles, temperaments, etc. A little bit of David Keirsey, even though I try to stay away from Keirsey with the 10-foot pole as often as possible, as well as Plato in Plato's Republic when he starts talking about guardians, artisans, thinkers, and idealists, etc., within his temperamental archetypes that Keirsey based his work off of. I take all of those sources and create individual systematized vectors. And each vector is something that you can use to inject yourself on the type grid, 16 type grid. And each vector can help you logically, through deductive reasoning, actually come to a conclusion as to which type of person is. And then the rapport method, which I use in coaching for type verification, is based off of each of those vectors, and it creates a system around each vector to identify, hey, you're this type because you're direct, you're initiating, you're control, but then you're also expert in sensing. You're all about, how you live in the moment, or what experience, or how you're coming off to others, how you're making people feel, but you're always willing to tell the truth and not bullshit other people. But you know what you want as well, and freedom of choice is the most important thing to you ever in this entire world, etc. But then at sometimes you don't know which choice you need to take, and you're kind of afraid of making the wrong choice, right? And it can go at that deep of a level as a result. And that's just one of the 16, because they're the structure artisan, right? You just have to identify if they're a structure type, which means you've just eliminated 12 of the other types, and then you go, and then it's 4 types. If you're a structure type, you're automatically an ESTJ, ESTP, ENTJ, or ENFJ. One of those 4, if you're a structure type. And then it's like, okay, now I have to identify what temperament you are. And then you go through the temperament check. And then like, oh, he's a freedom-based creator. He lives in the moment, and all about what he wants and freedom of choice. And take away his freedom, he becomes ragey, Okay, that's an artisan. Likes to create with his hands. Everything's all, in the physical, right?
But
Concrete.
you admit that, let's just say somebody lives in the moment. What would you say that's a ST you said?
As someone who lives in the moment is an expert sensor, someone who has
Okay,
expert
so
sensing in their ego.
wouldn't that just be a function of anxiety, of how you manage anxiety?
Living in the
So the
moment.
type is actually a function of, yeah, how you manage emotions.
No, no, not necessarily. Because so one's type is split up into 2 separate groups cobbled together. You have how you gather information and perception, and how you make decisions about it, judging, right? And perceiving, and also it's not just emotion; it's also memory management. So, for example, someone who lives in the moment has not that great of a long-term memory, and some people would label them forgetful. It's because new information is hitting their brain constantly, and old information is getting put out, but they don't have an introverted sensing hard drive that's big enough to take some of those older memories and hold them, and then they just let go of it, so they become forgetful. Or me, I'm the
Just
opposite.
like Kelly Bundy.
Fair enough.
There's an old Married with Children episode. There's this phenomenon. Kelly can learn anything she wants, but for one thing that she learns, she forgets something else.
Yeah, well, it
Stupid
uses
early
their
90s Fox.
Yeah, well, I watched it. I watched early '90s Fox hardcore, right down to Murphy Brown and Cheers, and oh my gosh,
Well, it's research for you because you're just looking at popular archetypes,
yeah,
popular types in television. So it's just research.
yeah,
You're watching
yeah,
dumb television. No,
yeah,
this is for my job.
yeah. I know, right?
It's my excuse.
Yeah,
It's
well,
all psychological, trying to understand how people interact. That's why
yeah,
I've been watching 5 hours of, whatever stupid thing I'm watching.
yeah. Well, I mean, at least the Mandalorian's coming out around the corner, and hopefully going to save us from the fact that Game of Thrones completely failed. Uh, you know, I hope Jon Favreau can get that figured out. But
Mandalorian?
The Mandalorian, it's a new Star Wars live action series coming out in November.
Oh, sorry, I'm more of a Star Trek guy.
That's okay, because
That's going to be the
Picard is
real
coming
debate:
out.
is Star Trek versus Star Wars. I'm going to get really pissed. It's going to be heated. Star Trek, objectively.
Actually, Star Trek is a way more of an intellectual approach, and I think Deep Space Nine is definitely the absolute best Star Trek to date. With just how, like, all the social interactions, all the different characters, all the different archetypes, they really did a fantastic job in Deep Space Nine.
But the women don't wear mini skirts, so
I mean,
I'm with that. So
that
for me,
is
it's the original series all the way, just because they're walking around. By the way, I loved in 1966. That was progressive, just because they had men and women were working together. I mean, their skirts are so short you can basically see their butt crack, but no, it's equal.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not here to debate modesty because I'd probably lose every time. It's funny. You could be immodest at home, but out in society you can't. And there's people who are getting confused between their external perception of themselves versus their internal one, which is what I'm trying to like help people manage. They don't. Most people don't understand that, and again, they're just relying on this test. The MBTI is nothing more than a test, and it's interesting because when you
Like you
first
have women shouting their abortions when they've never talked with anybody about having an abortion in a one-on-one sit down.
yeah, it happens. I mean, that's why I have a confidentiality
But
agreement.
that's what you mean?
Well,
I'm
yeah,
just
it happens. Yeah, exactly. Because there's some people are ashamed of a lot of things. People have secrets with them that they've never told anybody. That they didn't even that the only people that would know are the people that were involved in that situation. Or sometimes there's secrets that happen based on that people do alone that they don't even talk, and they hold on to those secrets to their grave because they're
or
just
they
too
don't
afraid.
even know themselves, like with a lot of abuse. Like you know, just it's just that's denial, right?
I had
No,
I
you
had
not
re-
know, but you don't know, you don't know.
Exactly, and denial is a huge problem, especially in my life, because when I was being, abused by my family as a youngster from the ages of 5 to 14, those memories were completely repressed, and they didn't come back until when I was 21. And why did that happen? It happened because all of my entire family was together in one place at a family reunion, and it just triggered a huge flood of memories of the past and a lot of pain. And then I had to take action as a result. You know what I mean? Because think about it, memory, right? Back
Tough.
to back to living in the moment. When people pick up an object, right? An extroverted sensor, it's like psychometry. They understand that there's memories attached to the object. So when an extroverted sensor who lives in the moment breaks up with like a man or a woman, they have a breakup, right? They erase that person by getting rid of all of the totems or the physical objects that remind them of their relationship and get rid of them completely in their life. And it's as if they're cutting them out. And then they can emotionally handle that because all those reminders are not physically there reminding them of those memories. Whereas someone like me, I don't get that. I'm not an extroverted sensor. I'm an introverted sensor. I have to take those memories with me of that relationship every single day. And it's permanent and it's not going away. And the only thing that can help me get rid of that is by generating new memories to cloud out the old memories, right? And that's introverted sensing approach because I have long-term memory. I have great long-term memory, but I have horrible short-term memory, you know? Whereas an extroverted sensor is great short-term memory. It's like RAM, but their hard drive is small for their long-term memory. That's the difference.
Yeah. I understand using types to help explain phenomenon going on. I just wonder why, like you say, you have a great long-term memory of a bad short-term memory. I wonder if that's not just an artifact of how you manage emotions, of the abuse that you said you've gone through, of certain things. Like it's
Well, that
not
was
who you
outside of
are
the
necessarily.
abuse. That was outside of the abuse. That was just in general, right? In general, because oftentimes I remember people telling me as a little kid, that oh, you're really smart because you can remember so much, and I'm like, memory has nothing to do with intelligence, but a lot of people see it that way, whereas a lot of people who don't have a good long-term memory think that they're stupid. It's just Dunning-Kruger effect over and over and over again. The smart people think they're dumb and the dumb people think they're smart, and we see this consistently. It's just like the scarecrow getting a diploma from the Wizard of Oz. What are we
Oh
doing?
crap, I think I'm smart. What does that mean? You got
Nothing.
me.
Yeah, well, I mean, to each their own, right? Pride comes before the fall. I'm trying to let go of that.
So you bring people in, you type them, and then you offer some kind of maybe adaptive strategy based on who they are, like the fat test. You have this body fat. Here's some things you could do to either decrease or increase your body fat. Because obviously implied in you coming to see me, is you want to change.
Yeah,
So
that's
these are your dominant functions. These are the inferior ones. Here's how you can make the inferior ones more superior.
in a nutshell. It's
I,
more
I
of
would say in general that's a pretty healthy thing.
Yeah, in general, yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, we identify their ego, and then we automatically know how the rest of their mind, their psyche is mapped out, and then we help them get through their gateways, which is how to get over your fear, how to get over your worry, how to get the most terrible side of you under control, and oh, you haven't developed your subconscious? Well, you're going to have midlife crisis around the corner. You might want to do that. You might want to get your subconscious fixed. Or, oh, you got your subconscious developed? Well, that means you're kind of an immature person because you haven't developed your shadow well enough. Here's how you do that. And then we give them a path of forward progression that gets them into a point where they're able to help themselves develop those tools that are unfamiliar to them. while simultaneously showing them how compatible they are with who they have intimate relationships with or with their children to help them parent better or help them improve their relationships. We give them specific rules that they have to follow for themselves and for who they're with, and rules that that other person has to follow for themselves, just so that people are able to have mutual respect and mutual love in a relationship to be able to reach where they need to go. And we follow human attraction dynamics theory for that as well, but that's another story.
Is this one of those situations where opposites do attract? You want an opposite type than as you?
Kind of, because yes and no. So the reason why I'm saying that is because if you go from the socionics point of view, they talk about the concept of duality, where you'd want an ESFJ with an INTP in a relationship. Wrong. That is so wrong. Why? Because having two introverted sensors in a relationship is just not going to be great. They're both going to be competing for whose comfort zone is dominant, right? And both those two types are going to be competing for who's more giving than the other, who's more intelligent than the other. And then they're going to accuse each other of saying, well, you make me feel unwanted all the time. And it's just going to lead into a destructive path. People need to realize that extroverted sensors need to be with introverted sensors because the SE users are trying to give the introverted sensors more, make them more comfortable, right? The extroverted sensor gets out of it is they get shared experiences. They don't feel abandoned. They don't feel alone. And then this they have this person who just is this walking totem of memory that remembers things for them all the time and watches out for their safety because the extroverted sensor tends to be forgetful as a result. The introverted sensor remembers everything for them. Like, oh, I'm so glad you can remember all of that. And while the introverted sensor, what they get out of it is that they're made more comfortable, they get better sensations, and I have a joke in my community. Extroverted sensors like to be on top, introverted sensors like to be on bottom in a sexual situation, right? And that's basically very primary. Anyone can do any sexual role no matter what in the bedroom, but some things are primary, some things are secondary. It goes right down to how cognitive functions can actually translate directly into primary sex positions over time. That can be explained, right? So we hit every
But
aspect of human interaction.
okay, I think I get that. But also these are just types. These may not be who you really are. So have you ever had the situation where where their personalities or the types, excuse me, are incompatible? So you go, this is not going to work.
Yeah, there has been
Even though you
situations.
can change and it's just where you are momentarily in time.
Exactly. So again, this is the nature versus nurtural argument. I can teach a person from a nature standpoint, which is basically the psyche and how the types work out. I can show them how they can make their marriage work and their relationship work. But sometimes the damage has already been done from a nurtural side and it's just not going to work. And then they end up agreeing to end the relationship. So there have been times, I will admit, where I have told people that they need to get a divorce. And as much as there have been times where people are seeking a divorce, and I'm like, you need to not get a divorce. What are you doing? You actually have something great here. Here's why. And then they're like, oh, wow, I could do that. It's like all of a sudden they've been given permission to behave the way that they need to behave. It's weird. And then when they're no longer ignorant about that fact, all of a sudden they're in a situation where, hey, maybe I should pay more attention to that. And they do. It's very, it can work. But again, it's all about work. Tortoise versus hare. Hard work always beats talent. And it just really depends on how much both people in the relationship are willing to put forward, just like it would be in any traditional counseling scenario.
Yeah, so then you're advising people to get divorced because at least one party is not willing to put in the work. They're not open to communication.
Yeah, because
Does that
I
have
have
anything
to.
to do with their type, though?
It can have something to be a type. So, for example, take an INFP type. An INFP is all about what their mood is and all about what their comfort is, which means they can come off to the other types as the most selfish of all the types because they're so focused on what makes them comfortable and so focused on what their mood is that they just become stuck in their own comfort zone in their own little world and they're just not going to change. And this is like where we get doormat syndrome from or failure to launch syndrome specifically because people are so unwilling to change and they're the least changeable of all the types because change is so hard for them and it's so scary for them to go out through it. Whereas you look at an INTJ, they still are all about their mood, but they at least are focusing on making other people comfortable and it's not about their own comfort. So they're not as selfish as an INFP just based off of that standpoint. You know what I mean? So yes, there's definitely some things that their nature applies for sure.
Yeah, I guess it's not so much a fundamental disagreement. It's just I would tend to err on how do you manage your emotions, and you would maybe tend to err more on what's your type.
Well, it's you still, regardless of what a person's type is, they still have to have personal responsibility. They still have to have getting over their insecurity and developing humility, because if they're insecure and afraid, they're going to have pride instead. And they still have to develop their own personal maturity, which they need. And then at that point they could finally get to the area where they could fix their own sense of evil, the human condition, as many psychologists call it or psychiatrists call it. The human condition itself can actually be solved, but only after they've reached those things, because that side of their mind, known as the superego, the superfluous ego, the superego itself, or the id, I think is what Freud would say. The superego just doesn't have respect for the rest of the psyche, because it's like you're irresponsible, you lack humility entirely, and you're immature. Why would I have anything to do with you? In order to woo that side of one's mind, you have to have all your other bases covered, which could take a lifetime.
Well, it sounds like what both got both of us into Jung in the first place is getting to a place of desperation.
Yes, sir. To be fair, I'll admit, even though I studied so hard, my marriage still failed because the damage was done nurturally. Even though I could do everything from a nature standpoint, she was already, because familiarity breeds contempt. There's still these additional nurtural components outside our nature that really impacts things. Yes, your nature can give you a way, as a framework with which to manage your emotions, but you yourself still have the responsibility to make the decision to be humble, to be responsible, to be mature. You still have to make that decision. You still have to make that commitment, either one, decision or commitment. And if you're not doing that, well, then it doesn't matter what type you are. Your nurture is just going to end up sucking, and then you're going to have failed relationships and neuroses and
Yeah.
and psychoses and all these things.
I usually wouldn't. I think people break up too prematurely. But if one of the people is really trying to reach out and communicate, and the other one just shuts down more and more, and it's been going on for I don't know 6 to 9 months, then at a certain point you just go, well, if you can't communicate, then there's no point going forward here.
I completely agree with you,
Which
and
sounds
that
like what sort of happened with you.
yes, it did happen. I actually go into my marriage at length and how that works in the episode in season 21 playlist called How to Social Engineer ESFPs. My ex-wife is an ESFP, and I explained, how our marriage was at that point. And even though nothing changed, I still made it work for, and to the point where we ended up having a mutual divorce, where she actually made the decision of wanting a divorce, even though I never did anything to her to, warrant any ire or negative issues or whatever. It's just familiarity breeds contempt. And there's just it after so many years of counseling and trying, nothing was happening. And I had to have self-respect and move on. So just like I would say anyone, because, we outside of type and nature, we talk about nurture, and for nurture, we have three different systems for nurture. King, warrior, magician, lover, according to Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette, that's actually nurtural. I don't put that as part of nature. I really don't. We have the four pillars of self intimacy, which is where people understand their personal responsibilities to take care of themselves, boundaries they set for others, personal standards, and then also personal goals, and how that helps you become a better person, nurturally speaking. And then we have human attraction dynamics, which is how do intimate relationships actually work, and how is a yin and yang equilibrium of love and respect? Because it's not good enough for a woman to tell a man, I love you. It never is. Because a man has to be respected. Why? Because women have this problem and men know it. They can love just about any jackass on the street. And men instinctively know that. And because of that, men need to be respected. It's not love is not good enough towards a man. They have to be respected, which is why this feminist society is causing so many problems, because men just can't handle that. And then you end up having MGTOW movements going around where men going their own way because men are not being respected, even though they know, instinctually speaking, they
Well,
are
they can't really
deserving of that
respect
respect.
themselves either. I mean, there's
Exactly.
there's a problem with women, but I think there's an even bigger problem with men. And I
100%
am
correct.
no feminist. I
Yeah,
see some good things in feminism, but I am definitely no feminist. But I can still, whatever criticism I have of feminism, I look at men and I think it's
sure.
it's
Yeah,
way worse.
the best there's a book called The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell. I completely agree with him and him identifying the problem with men, and I do agree with you that men are becoming more of a problem. And I think it's because of the Peter Pan syndrome as a result of the feminist society. And we may disagree with each other on that because there is no rite of passage. Because extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking itself is like how someone is regarded or what their status is, what their label is, what their title is. When you take away the rite of passage, and all rite of passage is men does XYZ tough thing, and when they complete that tough thing, then the rest of society respects that boy as a man and treats him as such after that standpoint because they respect his completion of XYZ thing or obstacle of some kind or hardship of some kind. The thing is, though, men continue to get through obstacle and obstacle and obstacle and hardship and hardship and hardship in life, but the rest of society doesn't respect it. And the rest of society doesn't treat them like a man should be treated as a result of that rite of passage, you know?
I would argue that men have to put themselves through their own rite of passage now.
They
And you
do
mentioned
now.
the Peter Pan
Yes.
syndrome. I think the first initiation that men need to go through is separation from the parents. I mean, not just financially, of course, but also psychologically.
I agree. That's why I say if you're king, warrior, magician, lover, you are not king until you have your own job, your own transportation, your own home, your own castle, because no king don't have his own castle. And his own castle means he lives on his own. No roommates and getting away from his parents. That's the requirement that I maintain as a standard for my audience and those that I coach. You want king, you need to get those three things. Then you're king. Then you can start looking for a woman, but only after you reach at a minimum king, because you're producing more than you consume.
Very difficult to try to meet a woman when you're still attached to your mom.
Exactly.
Oh, it's difficult. It
Very
just makes it so much more difficult than it already is.
preach it.
All right, well, it's good talking with you. I'm still, to be honest, I'm still a little bit unsure if going right to the types as opposed to the emotions. I think we just have a different way of approaching it. Maybe that goes, you would argue we're a different type, and that would explain it. Do you do
Uh,
that? Do you guess people's types, or is that an annoying question? Do people always come up to you and say, "Hey, what's my type?" And you just froze.
oh, sorry, I must have lost you there. Can
Yeah,
you hear
you
me
just
now?
froze. So the last thing I said was, is it annoying when people come up to you and ask what their type is?
No, it's not annoying. I mean,
Or you
it's
just don't think you can do it, like just with by meeting
well,
somebody.
well, I can. There's some times where I can. I could get within 5 seconds. I know. It's just that the thing is that what I have to tell them is stuff that they don't want to hear. You see what I'm saying? No one wants to hear the truth about who they really are, per se. And back to what you said about the emotional approach. There's nothing wrong with that. Like, sometimes you just have to be that sage on the mountain, right, where you're really trying to improve people and strengthen them and do it from a wisdom approach, right? You're doing that from like an emotional standpoint. There's nothing wrong with that. See, that's the difference. Like, I'm a very systematic person, so yeah, I may lead with type, but I'm still going to get to the emotions, right? You may lead with emotions, but you might get to the system at the end of the road afterwards. It's just different ways of getting to the same place. I have no issue with your approach whatsoever. Now, in terms of people asking me to be typed, it happens, but people don't usually ask because I have such a reputation of being able to dig into people's heads and do it quite publicly and quite easily and expose certain parts of them, like
Well,
their
let's do it now.
insecurities.
What do you think? What type I am? Am I gonna? Is this gonna be
Let's do
terrifying
it
for
now.
me?
Terrifying? Oh, I don't know. I mean,
What do
like
you think my type is?
So I would say or direct initiating control. So you're very initiating. You've been initiating the whole time. You haven't really been so responding. You could be direct responding movement, but it might be cognitive transition. What's your quadra according to socionics? I would say definitely STP NFJ quadra. So you'd be an STP type or an NFJ, specifically because I see extroverted sensing on an axis with introverted intuition and introverted thinking with extroverted feeling. You talk about emotions a lot, all about
You,
making other people feel good, you
you
know?
think I'm sensing?
Sensing or intuitive, I haven't gotten there yet.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah. It's all good. So direct initiating control or direct responding movement. You're very direct, but you're not. I don't think you're affiliative. Affiliative versus pragmatic is that an affiliative person is focused on doing the right thing. They ask permission for everything. A pragmatic person asks forgiveness after they do something, right? They just make the decision. They're very independent, whereas the affiliative person is interdependent. You don't strike me as an interdependent person. So I would say you're a pragmatic. So what types
I'm a
are
weird
pragmatic?
loner. That's pretty accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, well, anyway, the bottom line is, I would say you're either an ESTP or an INFJ, one of the two, and with likely being an ESTP, given that you're pragmatic, unless you're very cognitively developed towards INFJ side with ESTP subconscious, then you'd be an INFJ. But if I had to put money down on it, you're an ESTP for sure.
Okay, does it change your decision at all when I tell you that I can't stand wine tastings? These really bother me for
No.
some reason.
Well,
No?
well, is your freedom of choice being inhibited when you're there? Like, why? Like, who's there? What are you getting out of it? What is everyone else getting out of it? You know what I mean? Like, what's actually happening? Are you being obligated to be there against your will? I mean,
No, I just had the experience where I was walking by a wine tasting place, and I've tried them before. It's just very difficult for me to actually like write down tasting notes.
yeah. Why
It's
would you
just
want
like
to
the
write down?
sensing, just the focus on the sensation. It hurts my brain. Am I
Yeah.
dumb? I don't know.
No, it's not that. It's lack of extroverted thinking. So, like for example, take education. I'm married to an ESTP. She's amazing. But take it from an educational standpoint. The school system of the United States of America is all about like you do mathematics, right? Someone like you or someone like me, we just do it in our head and write down the answer because we know the answer, and then they get mad at us and accuse us of cheating because extroverted thinkers they have to mentally write it all out on paper and show their work basically and then get their answer, whereas an introverted thinker just can do it all in their head and then put down the answer. It's something completely different, and writing down those notes and following a system per se actually causes stress because that extroverted thinking, it's a critic function. It's only 15 frames a second of awareness hitting the brain. And by the way, the frames per second, those are very arbitrary. We don't know the actual numbers, but we just kind of know where they are in relation to each other, not really actually what the actual frames per second are. We haven't identified that yet. But it's such a compared to a hero function of extroverted sensing, which would be your hero, which would be 100 frames a second, which is the apex of your ego, the apex of your mind, basically the highest point in terms of cognitive function, and it has such a higher awareness, right? So using expert thinking, like taking little notes and describing these things, it just causes you stress. But if you were there with a girlfriend or a wife who was an STJ, who is really compatible with an STP, she'd be all about taking those notes and describing her experience, right? You could probably describe someone else's experience and just tell it to them, and hopefully they'll take notes about their experience that you observed that they had. But you don't need to do that because that just causes you stress. Why? Because it's stressful to use those tools. You know.
Okay, I mean, look, if anybody's out there who doesn't know exactly what you're talking about, I sure don't. You lost me in a few of those vocabulary words. They're like apex hero type. But I do appreciate the fact that it's clear you haven't succumbed to any of the the mistakes in thinking about MBTI and typology, things like that. So
Yeah,
it sounds
I
like you really have a good head on your shoulders. So if people want to find out more about you, csjoseph.life.
yes, sir. I appreciate that. I definitely agree that I need to take your advice and provide a more practical approach instead of being.
You see me over here, I'm making faces. I've read a lot of books. Some of these words and how you put, I mean, I know apex and hero. I just don't know what those mean
So
together.
I recommend you read Dr. John Beebe's book, Energies and Patterns of Psychological Type. He talks about
Okay.
cognitive attitudes, and I actually have a season on my YouTube channel. It's a playlist called Season 16. Season 16 talks about cognitive attitudes, and you can learn how each of the cognitive functions have different roles that they take in the brain. And they can and how the brain is basically a radio transceiver, sending and receiving signals. When your extroverted functions are sending signals, your introverted functions are receiving signals, basically, and you're tuning into different radio spectra, basically. I recommend that. That hopefully you may or your audience may find that useful. Who knows? So
Great, I appreciate it, and thanks for doing this. I would say an extra thank you. You know, I like probably one of the greatest compliments I could ever give somebody, or I could ever give somebody, especially an online thinker, an online intellectual, is that I just asked you to do this interview, and you didn't have any questions. You're like, sure, let's do it. Whatever. Like no questions. Yeah, let's just jump into it. No planning. That's uh that's a real compliment there, and I appreciate that.
yeah, no problem. I like honestly the way I see it, even though I have a hard time getting the practical to people, we have a book coming out that's going to fix that. But I know that what I'm talking about, uh, I mean, it's true. We have actual mechanical applications and practical applications. Just communicating it is hard for me, but we do have the actual concrete proof and evidence that this is true. It doesn't so it's like I'll talk to anyone about it. It's fine. They're not going to catch me in my words or anything like that. I'm just going to be straight up honest with them. Why do I have to ask questions? I am who I am, right? You know what I mean?
Excellent. All right, Chase. Thanks again, and I appreciate you joining me.
Likewise, sir, and thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate that you thought highly enough of me to actually allow me to be on your show. So thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it.
Of course.